student in this department, and I will be chairing the session today. And today we've got Edward John Bottomley, based in the UK at the moment. Edward is has been an academic, but is also a journalist, having published newspaper articles in Beeld, Rapport, Sarie and Taalgenoot. After publishing a book on the history of South African government policies on the so-called poor whites, he relocated to the UK and read towards a PhD in historical geography from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Commonwealth and Cambridge Trust scholar. As part of his studies, he spent a significant amount of time in the US, where he held a Rockefeller Foundation grant, and is currently engaging with theories of carceral geography with a view to publishing a book. So today, John is going to be talking about the anxiety of poor whites as it emerged from the beginning of the 20th century. And you have about 40 to 50 minutes to talk, and I'll give you a couple of pointers with the time.
Yes, please.
And then we'll open the floor for discussion. And for those of you who might be leaving a bit earlier but could attend, we will be joining afterwards for lunch at Taste Bud, for those who want to continue the discussion afterwards with John. Okay, so I'll open up the floor.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me, especially Yankee for extending the invite. I think first I should preface this by saying I'm by training a geographer and a historical one at that, which is not a discipline that's found very often in South Africa. So I am not a sociologist by trade or by training, but I do sociology adjacent work, typically that comes from my journalism work. Today, I figured I'd be talking about the idea that I worked in a paper and my thesis about transnational governmentality. But on the drive over here, I decided that that might be perhaps not too interesting to you, so I'm going to gesture at transnational governmentality, but focus more on poor whites and the idea of poor whiteism, things that might be more useful to you in your everyday work as sociologists. Right, the contents that we're dealing with here, I'm going to be talking about the poor white problem in South Africa, which is a very specific sort of what they termed a problem in a period from the 1900s to the 1940s. The idea of transnational governmentality, the Carnegie Commission, which I'm sure many of you may be aware of, which was a very well-known commission into investigating white poverty in South Africa, then investigating the cause of poor whiteism, and then the contradictions found in the Carnegie Commission. Right, so just to get everybody up to speed, although I'm sure it's very familiar here, what was the poor white problem in South Africa? So, at the end of the 20th century, after the Anglo-Boer War, the white population in South Africa had struggled with a number of issues such as droughts, disease, rinderpest, the Anglo-Boer War, and the Anglo-Boer War had led to the sort of destruction of agricultural land, arable land in South Africa. So that the white population, the agrarian population, progressively moved into the cities where they struggled with existing English interests. So a series of government commissions in South Africa investigated poor whites. Now, why were they interested in poor whites? Well, the obvious, or the number one reason, I think, is the question of white prestige. So we're here in the colonial South Africa, just post-colonial South Africa, but we're in the sort of colonial framework of mind. And throughout the Anglo world, the idea of white vulnerability, white degeneration, was problematic to the ruling classes. You can't. It's very difficult to sort of insist on inherent superiority when you have a large group of the population that is acting in ways that aren't superior at all. So they consistently, in the early 20th century, tried to figure out how many poor whites there were. As you can see there, 121,000, going all the way up to 1/3, and even some estimates of 1/2 of the white population, of the Afrikaans population, was in absolute poverty. Now, this number changes all the time, and you have to take it with a huge grain of salt. There's some great work from Stellenbosch recently questioning these numbers. So I don't, the 1/3 number comes from the Carnegie Commission itself. So don't take it as a hard and fast number. Rather take it as the government was very concerned about what it saw as a significant population, or part of its population, that struggled with poverty. So I think we can agree that for the governments of the day, the poor white problem sort of took on crisis proportions. As it went into the Great Depression, it was top of everyone's mind. Now, why? It's always difficult to how to put this. The poor whites initially are seen as problematic. They're seen as sort of a liminal population. They're most likely to be in the slums. They're most likely to, what they would say, commit miscegenation. They're most likely to fall in the eyes of the government, fall into crime. They're mostly likely to fall into gambling. There's a significant moral element there. But over a period of 50 years, they change. They're not viewed as troublemakers anymore. By the 1930s, their cause gets taken up by increasingly nationalist governments for essentially electoral gain, but also the cause of Afrikaner nationalism. It's profoundly interesting to see work from, say, the 1870s or the 1900s, where they're complaining about poor whites setting up tents in the middle of Johannesburg, whereas 30, 40 years later, we have people like Herzog and Smuts talking about the Afrikaner folk as a whole can't afford for these people to go under. So there's no question that they definitely become a sort of a celebrated cause for the Afrikaner nationalist governments, and also for the English governments throughout, or the Anglo governments throughout the world. It becomes so important, in fact, that a lot of the efforts and a lot of the policies that they take up to solve poor whiteism, to solve the problem, profoundly impact the policies of the South African governments. Things like, this all feeds into things like the Urban Areas Act, for instance. The second Carnegie Commission, which was in the 1990s, actually referred to the entire apartheid system as an anti-poverty program for whites, which is audacious, but does have a grain of truth in it, in that many of these, the policies to foster employment, the color bar, for instance, that were instituted to protect poor whites, ended up becoming foundations of the apartheid system. Where am I coming from? When we talk about poor whites, we typically think about South Africa. We talk where it has received a lot of attention. If we do talk about poor whites outside of South Africa, we think of the United States, for instance. But when I was doing my research, I realized that in the period, poor whites were throughout the world. As you can see there, they were in then Rhodesia, Kenya, the West Indies, the Dutch East Indies, Sri Lanka, India, United States, Australia. And my thinking was that perhaps it's not so much a South Africa problem as an Anglo problem in this period. That it's a conception that the colonial world, and I'm including the United States in that, shares. We think of it as a very much a state-bound thing, but in actual fact, it should be seen as a more transnational problem and a transnational population. That they conceived of poor whites not as South Africans or Americans, but they thought of poor whites as sort of outcroppings, racial outcroppings throughout the Anglo world. We'll get into issues of degeneration now. Right, as I said there, the national framing, obscures the transnational connections that we can think of. And in my work, I try very much to highlight that the poor whites, or to make the case that the poor whites are a transnational phenomenon. That's at the bottom there. I have a quote from Anne-Laura Stoller, the well-known US anthropologist, questioning, because she also comes upon this issue, and she asks that we write histories of state, histories of state projects that move beyond the state, and investigate how and why people could share understandings such as race mixing without agreeing who and what was included in that category. How could Australians and the United States and colonial India and South Africa, how could everybody have an idea of what poor whites were when they didn't quite agree on what they were? There was no hard and fast definition, but everyone sort of seemed to share sort of idea. If a South African talked to an Australian about poor whites, they would sort of broadly know what they were talking about. And why? Why was this? My argument is because the poor whites were a transnational population. Talking about the struggling to define them, they were called very different things in different times. So, in South Africa, poor burghers, in India, domiciled whites, a host of terms in the United States. In places like Kenya and Rhodesia, they talk about indigents and undesirables. And it's an older thing. So the poor whites in South Africa had been a problem since at least the 18th century, increasing in importance until the 20th century. But throughout the world, they'd been a feature since about the 17th and 18th centuries. Barbados work, which is done by a UK geographer called David Lambert, which is talking about poor whites known as red legs and red shanks, talking about colonial poor whites in the Barbados colonies. What theories am I using? I'm not ashamed to admit that I'm very much a fan of Foucault and his theories of governmentality and biopower. It's in the title of the presentation. Now, I'm not going to, we don't need to go into a sort of discussion about what biopower and governmentality is, but I do want to, just draw your attention to that definition, that the biopolitical role of the state in transnational governmentality, the disciplinary role of the state, its power to discipline and train its population in transnational governmentality is taken up by transnational organizations and transnational networks of experts. In this period, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, is before huge transnational institutions such as the World Health Organization, the UN. We have the League of Nations to a degree. But what I argue is that if you do have a transnational population, you have to have a transnational government or at least a transnational state to govern them, to discipline them. And my argument and the argument of other scholars is that this role was taken up by the huge philanthropies of the period. I'm talking about things like or institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Vast philanthropies that had unprecedented scope, unprecedented financing. John D. Rockefeller, richest man of his age, gifted the majority of his fortune to the Rockefeller Foundation, and had used these huge resources to undertake health projects throughout the world, India, South Africa, Europe. And part of this argument is that the experts employed by these large philanthropies, the doctors, the teachers, the professors, took up a disciplinary role, took up a governing role on what it saw as its populations. In my case, the idea that the poor whites are the population. And we'll get into this a little bit further as we go along. So, what I could do if I want to say poor whites in South Africa were transnational is I could go around to Ruyterwacht or any, the old poor white settlement of Ruyterwacht, or to look at different poor white settlements or initiatives in South Africa and try and prove how they were transnational. But that would essentially take up the rest of my life. That it is a very, apologies for that, it is a very, there's too much, essentially. So how I've tried to prove it is by looking at the Carnegie Commission, which was funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and is published in 1932, and it was essentially a government commission, well, not a government commission, although it did have the support of the South African government, but it was a private commission of inquiry into the poor white problem in South Africa, and show how that was a transnational, or how that had a transnational philosophy. So if I could show that the main sort of inquiry into poor whites in South Africa was transnational, then I think that would serve my purposes quite well. So, just to give a bit of background here, Fred Keppel in 1923 becomes the president of the Carnegie Corporation, and he's particularly interested in spreading the ideas of the American progressive movement. And he relies very much on key men, or what he calls key men. So these are professors of education, these are experts that he relies on throughout the world to sort of inform him on policy, to implement the corporation's policy or initiatives throughout the world. In South Africa, we have Charles Lorem, then Chief Inspector of Native Schools in Natal, and Ernst Malherbe from UCT, and also associated with Stellenbosch, and as the Americans pronounce him, Ernst Malherbe, because why not, I guess. All of these experts in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, sort of had a tacit allegiance to the global color line. They were interested in spreading, or interested in advocating for white men's countries and policies that would increase not white men's rule, but the increased civilization and progressive values with a focus on white populations rather than the non-white populations of these countries. For instance, that's a quote by Fred Keppel, president of the Carnegie Corporation, where he says, he puts this explicit. For those of us who believe in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, these far distant lands, such as South Africa and Australia, have a significance beyond anything that can be measured by their present population. The significance lies in an essential unity of the spirit and an agreement as to what things are really worthwhile in life. So even though these are different countries and different states, he's drawing a sort of, not a comparison, he's drawing them into a broader global color line, into an Anglo world that he sees as their area of initiatives and where policy can be implemented. So in 1928, the Carnegie Commission, Keppel and James Bertram, who was a station master in Natal, then Natal, but also became secretary of the Carnegie Corporation, traveled to South Africa. There they meet, in UCT, they meet, at the invitation of Charles Lorem, they meet Ernst Malherbe, who tells them about the poor white, what they call the poor white problem in South Africa, and he gives them a proposal, and he says, well, look, we have this big problem that's sort of taking up a lot of attention in South Africa, and we think you should look into it with the resources of the corporation, because we as a South African state and the South African people don't have the sort of the resources that you have. What's interesting is that when they do finally launch the Carnegie Commission, and I don't know if anyone's actually ever seen the Commission's report itself, or and I'm sure the library here has a copy of the report. There's 6 sort of chunky books, and quite a lot of background conversations between the different commissioners. I spent a lot of time in Columbia University's library looking through their different conversations. And in one of these conversations, they make it very explicit that the Carnegie Commission isn't just to look at white poverty, but it's explicitly for racial rehabilitation. So that under the proper treatment of this Nordic race, the qualities of the original stock might be brought to the surface in coming generations. So from the outset, the idea of the Carnegie Commission isn't just to count how many poor whites there were, or to see what policies they can use to uplift poor whites. From the outset, the objective is racial rehabilitation, to take the lowest class of poor whites and uplift them to at least something approaching the middle class. Now, the real meat of what I want to talk about here is the idea of poor whiteism. So the Carnegie Commission was not the first investigation of white poverty in South Africa. The Dutch Reformed Church had spent decades looking at poor whites in South Africa. There are various South African government commissions. But the Carnegie Report is the first time they really pay attention to the poor white question and to the idea of poor whiteism. And that's a key concept that I'm going to return to time and time again throughout this presentation. Poor whiteism. Now, they helpfully define it as the process of impoverishment with its sequels of moral and spiritual degradation. So a poor white isn't just a poor white. They're not just poor, and they're not just white. They are all people in the Anglo, all whites in the Anglo world shared a conception of poor whiteism. You could tell a person who was just white and happened to be poor from a poor white. These are two different classes that they distinguished. Strange enough, but it's very explicit in much media in the period where they would talk about, you know, they're poor, but at least they have dignity, they help themselves. On the other hand, there's the poor white, which is, you know, this moral and spiritual degradation. They don't help themselves. They've fallen into misery. They've fallen into a state of despair and moral lassitude. The Commission, just to give a sequel to what happened in it, is hugely successful. It resulted in Volkscongressen in South Africa for a number of years. It resulted in the establishment of this very Department of Sociology, the Department of Social Welfare, Alice Monhaber's National Bureau of Education and Social Research. What I'm trying to bring across there is that it results in a massive expansion of resources to discipline and to monitor poor whites in South Africa, to enact biopower on poor whites. So the governmentality, the expansion of the governmental resources of the state. But the Carnegie Mission is very strange, because you have 6 books, of which each one starts with a sort of introduction of their findings, and their findings ultimately agree on an economic basis. They say, well, poor whites are poor because they've, you know, economic reasons. They've struggled with the economy, farming, agrarian reasons, all the reasons that we now give for the appearance of poor whites in South Africa. But for most of those 6 books, they're concerned with completely different things. And this doesn't get that much attention from scholars, strangely enough. They spend a lot of time talking about eugenics, and they spend a lot of time talking about environmental theories of degradation. They test hundreds of school children for intelligence, for malaria. They spend a lot of time talking about climate. Very little time is taken talking about the economy. Only one book of the 6 talks about economy, which is a profoundly, as I say there, why do they spend so much time and money? They had a Ford. They traveled throughout South Africa testing school children, you know, in a period when motor cars were very rare in South Africa. They spent so much money on initiatives that they completely discount in the end. And as I say there, the answer is that they view the poor white problem in a transnational frame as a South African outbreak of a much broader crisis. What I mean by that is, it's not so much that they discounted all of these different theories and settled on a economic reason that's important. What's important is that they considered these theories in the first place. They had a playbook that originally had come mostly from the United States, but from the UK, from Denmark. They had a playbook for how to deal with poor whites that they were drawing on, a manual, and they first had to work through the manual to discount the various theories, to sort of find what the best tool is for the job to help poor whites in South Africa. And this manual goes through a number of different theories for what could cause poor whiteism. Some of it is educational based. You know, there's a lot of work on vocational education. Now, in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about environmental and disease theories here, because I have that quote here. So I just want to check if I have the quote. No, I don't. They spend a lot of time talking about completely what we would regard as silly things. Do dental cavities cause poor whiteism? It's a real thing that they investigated. Is the fact that they have a certain roving spirit the fact that they are poor whites? They investigate all these things, but they take rather more seriously environmental and disease theories for what causes a poor white. And the main one of the period, the 1920s, 1930s, is when eugenics reaches its sort of height of popularity. Now, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the idea of eugenics, but essentially it's the idea that a racial stock could be improved via breeding. So good people marrying good people results in good people. Good people marrying bad people results in bad people. And what you define as a bad person is obviously a very important question here. So as you can see there with eugenics, it's not only caused through miscegenation, but through simple contact. So good people marrying bad people, yes, but white people marrying black people, white people marrying Chinese people, sleeping with other races degenerates the breeding stock as a whole. It drags the white race down. And included in that is that idea of the moral and spiritual aspects applied to poor whites. So when you drag the white race down through interbreeding, you drag their morals down, you drag their spirituality down, they become worse people. So eugenics was very much an initiative, or is a science, and it was a very, it's hard for us now to understand it, but it was a very well-regarded, highly, in its period, highly scientific field of study in the period. It was studied throughout the world. There were eugenic initiatives across the world, most importantly in the United States and Sweden, where it ultimately resulted in the forced sterilization of what they regarded as people with learning disabilities, so that you would ultimately keep the white race strong. A side note here is they believe that in their words, and again, we're talking in the 1910s, 1920s, but they believe that the races that weren't white throughout the world were already practicing primitive eugenics by allowing their children, the weak children, to die, so that these races would then grow strong. So the white people of the period had to sort of catch up, as it were. Obviously, that's horrific. But we are dealing with people very far removed in time from us. So was the Carnegie Commission eugenic? Yes, very much so. As I said, Malherbe tested hundreds of school children, the IQ of hundreds of school children. So the idea of IQ testing comes out of eugenic science. Tested hundreds of them to prove that they were intellectually inferior to what he called normal school children. Again, how you define a poor white here is very difficult. And strangely enough, the Commission never manages to define a poor white. Their definition is, it's a well-known term and everybody sort of knows what it is. But it's the strangest thing, there's no, below this level of annual income is a poor white. It's very much sort of, you all know what I'm talking about, which is very, very strange when you're testing and classifying hundreds of school children. How are you, what basis are you using to move this one to that one, this class to that class? The results of his IQ testing was that he found that they were, unsurprisingly, he found that their intelligence was lower. Additionally, Malherbe, just after the report, publishes this article in the Star, Future of the White Race in Question, because of this, what he believed was a decline in intelligence. One of the other commissioners, Johannes Groskopf, is very eugenic in his writing, and he says, if the implication is that a poor white possesses the same personal and hereditary qualities as those who occupy a higher place in society, then it is, to say the least, a bold generalization. So we can definitely agree that the Carnegie Commission relies hugely on eugenics in the period. Another thing that they relied on to explain poor whiteism, the first was eugenics, was the ideas of climate and disease. Now, Ellsworth Huntington and prior to him a guy called, or an academic called Madison Grant, both Americans. Madison Grant was head of the New York Zoological Society. They raised these ideas that when white people move to climates that aren't seen as their traditional climate. So when they move to warmer climates like South Africa, like India, they lose virility. They lose a lot of what makes them, essentially the industrious Nordic nations. Huntington proposes the climatic hypothesis of civilization. So he actually says when white people move to South Africa or Australia, the climate results in a decrease in brain power. So their brains are actually moving slower than usual. And this explains why in the northern regions of South Africa, in the northern regions of Australia, in the south of the US, everywhere closer to the tropics, you find what they said that you find poor whites. In the United States, for instance, in the American South, there's a long tradition of concern over poor whites. Same in northern Australia, and in South Africa, strange enough, they're a bit more dispersed. In the period, they're seen as very much found in the Karoo, but also found in the bushveld. But as you can see there, when he migrates to places less stimulating, he loses in both physical and mental energy. So there's this climactic idea. And again, what are they trying to do? They're trying to figure out what causes poor whiteism. Not what is a poor white, what causes this idea of poor whiteism. So we've had eugenics. We have this idea of climate. Again, side note on the climate. The most powerful, the most important theories of that period were Ellsworth, Huntington, and Madison Grant, but it doesn't mean that they were the only people looking at climatic theories of white degeneration. There's a long history of scientists trying to find out why, in their view, when white people moved into the tropics, they became pro-whites. And this extended to a scientist called Osborne, I forget his first name now, who developed the theory of actinic rays, which was his theory, and he referred specifically to South Africa, was that the sunlight in South Africa and in places like India contained more UV rays than in England and the northern United States. And this increase in sunlight, the power of the sunlight, essentially cooked the brain to such a degree that white people became listless and pro-white. Another theory. Again, these people are far removed in time from us, but the idea behind actinic rays and the pressure on the brain pulls through to a lot of the colonial things that we see in the period. For instance, a pith helmet, that sort of colonial helmet that you see in the movies, is there to protect it's not a war helmet or anything like that. It's there to prevent the head from the effects of sunlight. Spine pads of reflective material were there to prevent the sunlight entering the base of the spine and cooking the brain. They took this very, very seriously. They had special fabrics that they developed. They being sort of the colonials of the period. And again, they're far removed in time. We can't judge them with our hundreds of years of science, continuing science. 50 years, yeah, it's not that long. Yeah, true, science moved very quickly. So the climate on the one hand, therefore, was an explanation for whiteism. The other idea was disease. Now, Raphael Salento, interestingly, has this long-running argument with Huntington of climate fame, where Huntington insists on it's when you move into the tropics that you become poor whites. Salento, who's an Australian, believes it's disease that causes poor whiteism. So it's not so much deficiencies in diet or malnutrition, but it is malaria, it is hookworm disease, it is pica that sort of underlies the appearance of poor whites in these regions. Interestingly, Salento worked in a town called Townsville in Queensland, northern Australia, which was specifically a region that Huntington had pointed to where he said poor whites appeared in many numbers. And Cilento sort of challenged him and said, well, I live here and I work here. Why don't you come over here and tell me that I'm a poor white? And Huntington took him up on the challenge, and after touring Townsville said, well, okay, everybody else except Townsville is where you sort of find poor whites. But coming back to our focus on the large institutions, the Rockefeller Foundation in the period, this is 1900s, very early in the 1900s, starting in the late 19th century, they begin a very interesting campaign against hookworm disease. They discover, the lifestyle of the hookworm is only discovered in this period, and essentially what hookworm disease does, is it causes anemia, which causes tiredness, lassitude, and they discovered that large parts of the American South were in fact suffering from hookworm disease. It's associated with poor whites, partly because in the American South, this was before significant sanitation initiatives had been undertaken. So we're talking about farms with outside privies, where poor whites are typically walking without proper shoes, and hookworm ends up through the foot. So part of what the Americans do, or the Rockefeller Foundation does, is it undertakes huge sanitation campaigns to create sanitary privies. And it also figures out, or in the period they discover how to cure hookworm, which is a very quick and easy dose of medicine, and then you expel the hookworm. So it's very easy to get rid of. And they called it the germ of laziness. They actually went so far as to say that the entirety of poor whites were caused by hookworm, that this disease, hookworm disease, underlay the appearance of poor whites throughout the world, and that they could, through a very quick and easy medical cure, essentially cure poor whiteism. So this is the idea, which I love, of poor whiteism as pathology, the disease of poor whiteism. They also, a side note is that they also believed, or they went so far as to say that that it was hookworm disease that was responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire. They were very taken up by this idea. I think, again, the point I'm trying to make here is that they were trying to find what caused poor whiteism. Not poor whites, but poor whiteism. And the people who were trying to find out what caused poor whiteism were these transnational scientists and doctors. Now, as I say, they're all part of a transnational effort to manage the health of the white race, of which the poor white was the most visible symptom of sickness. So there's doctors throughout the world. There are Americans, there's South Africans. C. Louis Leipold, the well-known author and doctor in South Africa, is a huge part of this. They're British, they're Australian. They're throughout the world, and they're trying to manage the health of the white race so that the outbreaks of poor whiteism don't occur. It's not state-bound. They're not saying, well, it's only in the United States, it's only in South Africa. They're seeing it as a more, in some cases, as a climactic thing, as a disease thing. It's a transnational initiative to manage the transnational health of the race. Another disease that they were very concerned about was malaria. Now, I just want to see if I do this. Okay. Malaria is something we in South Africa understand quite well, but the idea that malaria caused white degeneration and poor whiteism might be new to some of us, but it's actually quite long-running. Various British, I was going to say, of course, British academics had ascribed malaria as the reason for the backwardness of the French. They said the French peasants were caused by the outbreaks of malaria in France, the Pontine marshes in Rome. Again, if I was to refer to the international institutions, the Rockefeller Foundation had huge, long-running anti-malaria campaigns. They went through the Pontine marshes in Rome with spray cans of DDT to rid the marshes of malaria. Now in South Africa, they believed that malaria caused poor whiteism. Not contracting malaria, because that's quite easy to do, and colonials had contracted malaria for hundreds of years. It was living in a malarial region for generations that you gradually degenerated the race. So you can see it's got sort of an eugenic aspect to it as well. The different generations became, as they contracted malaria, became ever more degenerate. Leipold, as I mentioned before, is a very big investigator of this. If you ever read Bushveld Doctor, it's fascinating. He essentially goes around to, he was an inspector of school, medical inspector of schools, and he goes around to all these schools and just writes his observations of the school children. And he essentially says, well, he's in the Bushveld, and he says, well, the school children are all degenerates. He's hugely worried about the future of the white race because malaria, they've all got malaria and they're all degenerates and they're all essentially ending up like the American South. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Deliverance, but it's sort of like that. So what the Carnegie Commission does is they, again, what I'm trying to prove is that they're drawing on sort of transnational theories. They directly replicate his studies. They go to the same schools that he did. Three of the commissioners, Murray, Wilcox and Malarba, spend a month going to the same schools and testing school children for symptoms of chronic malaria, and this is in the same period when they did the intelligence testing. So spleen size is an indicator of that you've contracted malaria, which is, they essentially, if I was going to talk about it in biopolitical and governmental terms, they're weighing and measuring, testing school children for malaria, which is a hugely sort of biopolitical, disciplinary way of managing a population. If we're talking about Foucault's theories, if we're thinking about things like the panopticon, it's a very direct analog to disciplining health and disciplining populations. So I just want to check. Interestingly enough, the annual report to the school medical department, which Leipold did, also from 1916, I think they start measuring, or they start publishing indicators of spleen size in the Bushveld as well. Which is sort of like an analog for malaria incidence in the Bushveld, which continues analog for the incidence of poor whites in the Bushveld. So to get back to my theories of transnationalism, the Carnegie Commission investigated hookworm and tropical degeneration in South Africa. When hookworm disease doesn't occur in South Africa, there's some incidences in the mines near KwaZulu-Natal, but it's not a disease typically found in South Africa. We're not in the tropics. The northern part of South Africa is the closest that we come to it, but then we're looking at places like the Karoo as well, and throughout the country. So why are they using these strange theories to look at South Africa? And the answer is that they are, as I mentioned before, they're drawing on a manual of how to manage and cure and discipline poor whites. They already have the playbook, and they're discounting certain theories to try and sort of settle on the best explanation for poor whiteism and poor whites in South Africa. This is an explanation that did not foreground economics. That's the story it's all about. Essentially, his reasoning, which I agree with, is, so why in the end do they settle on this economic reason for poor whites? Remember, it's 6 books, of which the conclusions ultimately settle on an economic reason for poor whiteism, but the majority of the Carnegie Commission, what I call the Carnegie contradiction, is focused on intelligence testing. It's focused on climatic theories. That debate between Salento and Huntington, the disease of Townsville, who foregrounded disease, and Huntington, who foregrounded climatic theories of degeneration, is mentioned in 2 different books. That entire debate is is published. Pages are taken up to reprinting that debate. So it's very, very strange that they spend all this time on stuff that they know doesn't apply to South Africa. Now, what de Bouw argues is that because of the struggle for, this is 1928, so because of essentially political reasons, an argument that the poor whites were not capable of redemption would be untenable. So the nascent Afrikaner state in South Africa had in its interests under Smuts to, again, we come back to theories of white prestige, had in its interest to say, well, climactic and disease theories of white degeneration can't be cured, they can't be stopped. So we need a theory that means we can uplift poor whites. We need a curable, a solvable theory. And the argument is that any other explanation other than economics would be detrimental to white prestige. It had to be something that you could cure through initiatives, through money. It had to be capable of redemption. So I'm getting into conclusion, and I have timed this perfectly, I'm so glad. My conclusion here is that the poor white question, the poor white problem, and poor whiteism form part of a series of governmental attempts on a global scale through the Carnegie Corporation, through the Rockefeller Foundation, through the Ford Foundation, through these large layers between government, a layer above governments, which aren't governments in themselves, but they have the resources and the funding and the reach to implement a lot of initiatives that governments can't in the period, especially governments like South Africa. Their initiatives reach beyond any state. It's not South Africa, it's not Australia, to bolster and manage whiteness. Now, it's the key men that Keppel uses, the experts use, conceive of it originally. It's transnational from its inception. It's an Anglo project to bolster the transnational white race. They're not trying to redeem South African poor whites or the poor whites of the US South. They're trying to redeem and uplift the poor whites of the white race in total. And ultimately, hope for the future is that when we treat poor whites in a disjointed manner as saying, well, we're only looking at South African poor whites, and we're not seeing them as part of a broader transnational outbreak or problem, it hampers our analysis of this population and of the role that they've played in history, and that twisting our thinking, just rejigging our perspective on poor whites to this sort of transnational perspective can be very, very useful in analysing the population. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward.
Yeah, where am I going?
Where are you going?
I'm sitting here.
Yep. Where would you like to sit? Thank you. Right, we're going to open up the floor for discussions. So if we can keep the questions to just a short sentence, perhaps, for John to answer. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was quite fascinating. I generally take it, I mean, this is fine. Of course, it's transnational. I accept that. This whiteness is much more than only South Africa.
Sure.
We're talking about settler colonialism, Nordic countries, it probably even goes beyond the Anglo-Saxon. So that's my one question. You seem to reduce it to the Anglo-Saxon, but when you hear de Bouw talk about the circulation of scientists like these archaeologists and these other guys, often they come from the German-speaking world. So you have Austrian and stuff like that, right? So I guess my question, okay, so this is a critical question, is the question of what happens when so I take your argument that it's transnational, but I don't accept this idea that you're making it about governmentality.
Okay.
The reason is, like, what kind of government are you actually speaking about? Right? Because Foucault is talking about the European government, right, and how they develop nation states. So to call the 1920s South Africa a government is kind of a euphemism, which doesn't account for the fact that this is a military kind of expansion. Of course, they are trying to produce states, which we know from Walby and all these guys, right? It's effect. But from the perspective of a black person in South Africa, it's not a government in the sense
Yeah.
right? That is a rational form of scientific control, you know. So that's the first question. What does it do to call this governmentality? Maybe you need to, you know, re-specify, because it's really about a white colonial government trying to regulate its white population. But anyways, I guess that's just a general. And then, sorry, one more small thing. The other question really is about, I also don't accept this, and I know Dubois also makes these arguments, I don't know if you work with him. I don't accept this idea that this science was widespread and widely accepted. This is a very easy argument which kind of writes off all the science as part of its time. Right? What we know about things like eugenics, they were highly contested. Right? So I guess that's also what I want to speak about. Are you really arguing that eugenics and racial science in the 1900s to 30s is just widespread? Or even though it's been done by government, right? There are scientists who are actually going against this.
Sure.
So I think that maybe you can tell us about what a contest over the science itself.
Certainly on eugenics, it's contested, but I'd argue that it's hugely widespread. There's a great book by Alison Bashford talking about the history of eugenics, where essentially talking about eugenic projects throughout the world. So whether it's the dominant science of the day or whether it's widespread are two different things. It's certainly widespread in that it is in South Africa, it's in Sweden, it's in Japan, it's in Germany. Think of almost any country of the period, and there are eugenic efforts or eugenic society, or there are societies for the advancement of eugenics in that period. That's not to say it's not controversial. Of course, it was hugely contested in its day. My point there is rather that it was widespread and widely known, and when you're grappling with in the period theories of racial degeneration, that would be the first theory that they'd almost go to. The idea of governmentality, you're absolutely right. I don't regard the South African state as in the period as being particularly capable of governmentality. So part of what I tried to do in my thesis and in this paper, and I couldn't really get into it that much. I jumped through the governmentality stuff quite quickly, and I apologize. But what I tried to show is that there's this layer above governments, this transnational governmentality. So you need a transnational government that disciplines and enacts biopower on its state. So my argument was that this loose coalition of huge philanthropies, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the League of Nations Commission for Malaria, the sort of philanthropic layer, which was far more well-resourced than anything the South African government could offer, through its conception of, in this case, the poor white population as its population, and through its transnational careering experts, people like Keppel, Malherbe, Lorem, were the policy makers in that layer. So the doctors and educators in that layer were the ones enacting biopower on this transnational population. But I completely agree with you that the South African government is more of a military. Yeah, my argument is I agree.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I really enjoyed that, and I would agree with Shahid that very, very clearly you've put to us the transnational character, and I think it's important if one looks at Afrikaner nationalist history, which sees itself as being somewhat enclosed.
Yeah.
As Shahid said, I've got two questions, if I may. The first question, as he said, is you talk about a global colour line, which I understand. I've spent quite some time in Canada, in French Canada, and there are a lot of similarities in the Canadian and the imperial British rule over the two countries that distinguished there between Anglo and the Francos who fall ill from malaria and through that become somewhat degenerate, and here. And many of the examples that you gave were more Anglo-Saxon Nordic than they were Caucasian white. So would you say that an important question is both count in South Africa, both the colour line, but also the Anglo-Saxon Northern Caucasian line, with the Anglos looking down upon the Afrikaners in terms of some line that was drawn? I mean, that was the first question. because it did strike me, as it did Shahid, that many of the examples you gave were not Caucasian in the sense of white, as but more northern. If I can ask the second question, if I may, very, very briefly. I've read recently the book called Pale Rider, which is a book about the Spanish flu of 1918, which had extraordinary social, geographic and political effects on the global population, including South Africa, both in the former Ciskei as well as... I've also read Mukherjee's The Gene, which I've seen you've read, because in fact you quoted. My question, which I think is an important one in South Africa, is that if we do away with biopower, we do away with the idea of biopower, we then either have a blank slate, where genes and bio no longer count, we are how we are nurtured, or in terms of Mukherjee, there are genotypes that lead to phenotypes. Certainly not races, as the anthropologists have been making mistakes with the British anthropologists and the Europeans. Would you go on the genotype to phenotype route, or would you go on the blank slate, let us not look at the genome-phenome approach? Which is, I think, for us in sociology and the social sciences, a very important question.
On your first question about the Anglo perspective, you're quite right that most of the examples I'm drawing from are from the Anglo perspective, of which Canada in this period forms a part. Partly that's intentional, because I'm dealing with empires and imperial way of thinking, imperial networks, but it doesn't preclude German or French networks. It's purely the limitations of my own form of study there. If we're talking about a global color line, though, which is a book that appeared a number of years ago, talking about essentially the white developed world in opposition to the non-white developing world, they include France, Germany, Europe. The end result there is it's purely my unit analysis, but you can easily add in other nations, other European nations. They, of course, in the period, or the 19th century, so it's before this period, had their own struggles with whiteness. I don't know if you know the work on New York about the Irish struggle to gain white status, the German struggle to gain white status in places like New York. But pulling it back to this, you're quite right. I'd certainly say it's a global European, not certainly Nordic thing. It's the unit of analysis that I was using there. On the genome blank slate, I don't know. I'm a geographer and historian. I can't. I'm outside of the discipline. I have to look into that more. I apologize.
Thank you. I think my first question I find similar as Bill on some of the other comments that I enjoyed very much. And so it's around the weighting between the transnational and the national in terms of, and I'm thinking about South Africa, I suppose particularly because you appreciate the hearing about transnational and the importance of that, and kind of moving away from the kind of South African decisions. I think that's really valuable. But the possibility then that you end up by placing more weight on the transnational, you kind of de-emphasize, move away from an understanding of the way in which things actually get taken up at the national level. And then linked to that, it's also around your characterization of these big philanthropic organizations, which clearly have power, money, and influence policy, as a transnational government, as opposed to a national government. It seems to me they don't really constitute a government as such. I mean, they can be clearly influential, but the actual way in which policy gets taken up is state-specific, albeit, the South African state was obviously specific at that time, and in flux in various kinds of ways. So it's just around that weighting.
Sure. On the transnational losing some of the national characteristics, you're absolutely right. I didn't get a chance to go into it now, but part of the conception that I use is that importance of the local characteristics. So saying that there's a transnational layer and a transnational population, but that in each site, as it were site-specific outbreaks of a transnational sort of disease or population. So to say, I'm not trying to say that they. So as you can see from the Carnegie, they had a sort of playbook that they were using, but they had to sort of. It had its own specific national characteristics that they had to adapt it to. So it's not a uniform population with uniform characteristics. In each area that they looked at, local policies, local history, local government, local interests formed that population, but that they could still use this playbook to sort of try and discipline and enact biopower upon them. But you're quite right that a transnational perspective applied bluntly like that would lose a lot of the very important sort of local characteristics, and it's something I've tried to be very careful about. On the layer of government, again, I agree with you. They're not a government. Well, they weren't. I'm not trying to argue that they're a government enacting policy. I'm trying to argue that they have a governmental way of thinking and are enacting biopower. So they could certainly influence policy, and in South Africa they hugely influence policy, and in the United States. So they do have policy implications, but I'm more interested in the way that they are thinking about their populations, and that they are thinking of it as a population that they can discipline and train across national borders. But they certainly don't have the same power. Rockefeller Foundation, you might argue otherwise in the period, but they certainly don't have the same, quite the same resources as a government would have. But it is a layer above a government that can still enact sort of governmentality on a population.
Thanks, Robert, for a very interesting talk. I like the fact that you, as many other speakers have said, the idea of transnational governmentality that you introduced is very, very convincing, persuasive from my side. And how I thought about this poor white problem in the South African context, I've looked at it from the welfare perspective, how the initiatives of the 1930s after the Great Depression, especially in Britain, were brought to the South African context by the National Party to try to deal with this idea of white rehabilitation. And I didn't hear you mention anything to that effect, especially with regards to the welfare, how this notion of the welfare was used as evidence of transnational governmentality. That's the first part. So,
everybody has follow-on questions.
Yeah. The last one is very simple. We do have a significant population of local whites today in South African context. Can we still think about this problem in terms of this transnational governmentality?
So on the first part, yes, you're quite right. What I think about, and when you bring in these welfare, and that it's such a broad. We could talk about the Carnegie Commission resulting in the establishment of the Department of Social Welfare. But from the British side, what I find very interesting there is work that a colleague of mine and Siebert's, Sarah Duff, has done on the narrative of child welfare in the period, specifically looking at white slavery, what they called white slavery, and the idea of the vulnerable white child in the period. So it comes sort of from the British tradition of abolishing child workforces, but then moving into this idea of safeguarding the interests of children through various social initiatives that would discipline populations and ensuring the welfare of the children, most visibly by not forcing them to work in a factory. So yeah, you're quite right. I didn't address it, but it certainly, there's a lot of transnational narratives that feed into this that I just didn't talk about for ideas of time. On today's poor whites is a very interesting question, and I'd have to think a lot about it. To be honest, I don't have an answer for you because I simply haven't thought about it enough. So when I do, as you would know, I look at modern poor whites and in places like the Nederwacht, but that's it's more of a sociological perspective. My theoretical work is more historical. Could you argue that they're part of a transnational network? I don't know. I'd have to think about it, Yankee. But it's a very interesting question, and I'd love to talk to you about it afterwards.
And are we allowed second chances?
Yeah, second round. Right. Michaela, you start?
Thank you. I was just curious to know, so I found, I suppose, a bit fascinating that there is no clear definition of what poor whiteism and poor whites are. But of course, I suppose we understand it as a social construct, right?
Yeah.
But was that particular date and place when the term was first used? I don't think you mentioned.
Okay, second round. Smith, okay, Simon, and then Cheryl.
Very briefly, I don't know whether everyone knows that the first head of the Department of the Sociology and Social Work at Stellenbosch was Hendrik French Vervoet, who was directly involved in research which was funded by the Carnegie Corporation's work in the mid-1930s, right?
Yeah.
Right. Did you find out anything about the role that he, Vervoet, played as the head of this department, which was both sociology and social work at the time?
Yeah.
Okay, then Cheryl.
Yeah, it's around, I'm just, a long time ago I did work on the Garment Workers Union.
Yes.
And which was proletarianized Afrikaans young women, poor whites, moving into towns and becoming members of the Garment Workers Union and becoming politically active and militant. So that issue of, you could cast it as degenerative, but also there was a politics and a kind of political consciousness, and how much of that subtext or directly is also being referenced in the discussions around degeneration.
Okay, excellent. So on the on the definition of poor white, so the term poor white comes from the antebellum South or American South, post-slavery. So there's quite, I don't know if you know the work of David Rodiger, but there's quite a lot of work on the terminology of essentially not slave in the period, so that the appearance of specific white interests in the period are not slaves, whereas which would give the, sorry, I'm not explaining that very well, the insistence on race, and specifically white race in the period of the antebellum South, defining themselves as not slaves so that they would gain greater access to resources. But the term originates there. It's a derogatory term given by freed slaves, recently freed slaves, to poor whites. The term itself, it's never defined. I don't think it's properly defined today, because you don't necessarily have to be poor to be a poor white or unemployed. Many of the poor whites in Johannesburg in the late 19th century were transport riders, were brickmakers. They had employment. They had income. If they were, it straddles the line between essentially poor and working class, and they're not necessarily white either. So they're worried about these whites committing the sin of miscegenation. They're staying in shanty towns. They're most likely to come in contact with other races than sort of British colonials or Afrikaner nationalists in the period. So poor whites aren't necessarily poor or white. It's a very, very strange term. What's more interesting to me, what's also interesting to me, is that how I try, because I've always thought maybe we should term them as failed whites rather than poor whites, because it's a bit of a stronger term. But poor whites are afflicted with poor whiteism. It's the way I've sort of thinking about it to myself, which is why I put a lot of emphasis on poor whiteism there. It's a pathology. It's a moral and spiritual degradation that distinguishes a poor white from someone who is poor and white. On the Verwoerd work, I didn't do much work on him, apart from that he was very much involved in the study and he was here. It's a bit. It went a bit further than my period of academics, or my period of study. But Verwoerd is one, but equally hugely interesting in the period there was D.F. Malan, who was also very involved in the study. It's very interesting that through the Volkskongresse, especially in the 1930s, but there's throughout that period, the 1910s and 1920s, Volkskongresse that are happening, many of the later very well-known nationalists like Verwoerd and Malan are, especially Malan takes the lead of these Volkskongresse. I mean, he's editor and he's a Germany. I think it forms part of this sort of the capture of the idea of white for Afrikaner nationalism and political gain. Now, one, you have a huge population of poor whites that you can gain the votes of, but on the other hand, if you can make it an issue, a unifying issue, and there's a lot I can talk about here, stuff like the 1938 Groottrek, the establishment of nationalism, or Afrikaner nationalism, but I think, as we've seen in the American elections, or America over the last few years, that if you can make a unifying case for ethnic nationalism, that it can be hugely effective, which is what people like Verwoerd and Malan did. And a lot of it came from their interest in the Carnegie Commission and the Carnegie Commissioners themselves, many of whom actually became quite active in nationalist circles afterwards, which is a strange side note to that. On the question about the government workers' union and the proletarianism, yes, that's very interesting. There's always a long-running subtext between, on the one hand, the way they talk about race. So when they talk about race, as many of you will know, they're not necessarily talking about people of color and white. They're talking about Nordic. They're talking about Russian, or British, or Afrikaner. The different white races that they're delineating. A lot of the times that they, especially Keppel from the Carnegie Commission, or the Carnegie Corporation, they're always worried about how do I term it? Sorry. They're very worried about sort of communism and sort of Soviet activity. The part of the reason, I think part of the reason that they're very worried about poor whites in the period is not only because they're most likely to turn to crime in their eyes, most likely to betray the race, but they're also most likely to turn to communism, to unite with the working class into sort of proletariat revolution. So to answer your question, it's always there. It's always sort of bubbling under the surface. It's part of their fears. It's not just a racial degeneracy thing. It's also a Soviet communist. Sometimes the anarchists come in as well. It's always under the surface. Yeah, you're quite right.
Anyone else? Well, maybe while you're thinking, I was just, if I can answer a question myself, John. You were talking about racial rehabilitation, and obviously we know how that was implemented in South Africa, but you seem to be saying that they're working from sort of a blueprint, a framework. Could you speak to me, elaborate a bit more on how that was implemented across the various regions?
Sure.
The similarities maybe, and the differences?
Yeah, I think the one the very obvious one, or let's say that the locus is always the US South, where since the late 19th century, the Rockefeller Foundation had financed a lot of efforts to sort of rehabilitate whites, and it's very explicit. It's not couched as much as, oh, we're just trying to uplift the South, although there is that, the national characteristics that we talked about, but they are very specifically trying to racially rehabilitate poor white Southerners. Part of what they do how they do it is they finance these huge hookworm campaigns with a cure for hookworm, because they see it. They talk about it as the germ of laziness, and by curing the hookworm disease, they cure poor whiteism. So the Rockefeller Foundation for something like 20 years has these extraordinary campaigns where they virtually wipe out hookworm disease in the US South. Additionally, they have, so I only spoke here about disease and environmental reasons, but there's, as I alluded to, there's a lot of stuff around education, there's a lot of stuff around urban planning that they also bring in. So on education, they essentially reform and this is one of those instances where it's a private corporation or private foundation, but it has real government power. In essence, the US government in the period, this is the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and there's quite a scandal around it as well. They sort of deputize the Rockefeller Foundation's education initiatives as their school initiatives. So they sort of say, okay, well, the Rockefeller Foundation can, redo our school system in the South, because in the period these are one-teacher schoolrooms in rural areas, in sort of, as they characterize it, falling apart buildings, one little stove. So they have this huge campaign to train teachers, to bring in more teachers, to redo the curriculum. This is all focused, this is all focused very much on the US South, and it's focused very much on training and educating poor white school children. Let's see, on the urban planning, I mean, later off, should I talk about urban planning? Because that'll continue for ages, but it's very much how they try and rebuild houses. So this comes out of the New Deal, and the alphabet agencies and the various rehabilitation initiatives that they had for farmers recently made poor during the New Deal, is they try, very much like Reiterwacht, they try and build ideal communities with ideal buildings, so that these poor whites could start on sort of a middle class, so they get them on loan at like at no interest, essentially, or very low interest, could start on sort of a middle class footing. Equally, as I mentioned with poor whiteism, there's always a moral, spiritual element to it. So the houses are new, they're surrounded by garden space, they're spacious. There's always this, to try and put the poor white, to put them in rehabilitative spaces so that they might, regenerate. There's always a church nearby. There's a lot that they do around built space to rehabilitate the poor whites of the period. Yeah, the US South is particularly interesting. So, what I meant by them using a playbook is the commissioners are constantly requesting material, pamphlets, books from the Rockefeller Foundation. So the Carnegie commissioners are requesting pamphlets from the Rockefeller Foundation. They have 2 US academics that are on a consulting basis in South Africa with them. So they have all the material that a lot of these initiatives that they do in the States. So on the disease, they reform farming, for instance. we're not going to go into that, but
We'll keep it for lunch.
yes, we'll keep it for lunch. But essentially, a lot of these initiatives are very successful in the US South, and those experts, sort of, in the case of the academics, directly travel to South Africa to act as consultants, and they bring all the material and the pamphlets and the playbooks for the South Africans to work with, so that they can see what worked in the United States. In the case of education, the US drew from Denmark and their fork school system. They're drawing from a lot of different places, but primarily where it was where the resources existed to implement it most thoroughly was in the United States.
Anyone else got anything to ask Edward John? Okay, otherwise come join us for lunch please. We're going to be going over to the taste bud. For about shortly